Picture Europe in 1796. A 26-year-old general nobody's heard of is about to rip through Italy like a hurricane through paper. But what if the most decorated defender in football history had been born 2 centuries early and stood on those battlefields instead of San Siro? Not to play football, obviously, to command armies, to defend territory, to protect Italy using the same principles that made him untouchable on the pitch. This isn't about dropping Paolo Maldini into history with a modern playbook. It's about understanding what made him exceptional and how those exact traits would translate to 18th century warfare. Because here's what most people miss. The principles of elite defense don't change across centuries. The execution does. The weapons do. But the mindset, that's eternal. Napoleon Bonaparte storms into Italy in March 1796 with something the world hasn't seen before. Not just an army, a completely new way of thinking about war. While Austrian generals still move troops like chess pieces according to dusty rule books, Napoleon understands speed, concentration of force, the brutal efficiency of hitting one spot with everything you have before the enemy realizes what's happening. He doesn't fight by the rules because he's rewriting them in real time. His army of Italy starts with 38,000 half-starved, poorly equipped soldiers. The Austrians and Piemontese facing him have 52,000 well-supplied troops with better positions. On paper, Napoleon should lose. In reality, he wins 12 battles in 12 months. He doesn't just defeat his enemies. He humiliates them. Montenotte, Millesimo, Dago, Mondovi, each battle a masterclass in doing the impossible. Within weeks, Piedmont surrenders. Within months, Austria is begging for terms. But Austrian incompetence isn't the only reason Napoleon succeeds. The Italian states defending themselves are fragmented, poorly coordinated, stuck in old patterns. They fight the way their grandfathers fought. Slowly, predictably, by the book. Napoleon moves faster than their communication systems. He's already behind them before they finish writing orders to face him. So what changes if one of those Italian states gets a defender who thinks differently? Maldini's career spanned 25 years at the absolute top. Not just playing, dominating. 7 Champions League finals, 5 wins, 647 appearances for Milan, 26 major trophies. But statistics don't explain what made him special. Plenty of players have impressive trophy cabinets. What separated Maldini was something else entirely. He read the game 3 moves ahead. Watch footage from any era of his career. Early 20s, late 30s, doesn't matter. He's never scrambling, never desperate, never caught out of position unless he's chosen to take that risk for tactical reasons. That's not luck. That's not physical gifts, though he had those too. That's pure football intelligence operating at a level most defenders never approach. Modern analysis breaks down his positioning using heat maps and tracking data. The numbers confirm what the eye test showed. Maldini existed in perfect spatial harmony with threats, not too tight, giving attackers room to exploit, not too loose, allowing easy passes. Exactly where he needed to be to have maximum options when the play developed. He didn't react to attacks. He positioned himself so attacks had to react to him. The comparison to military defense isn't metaphorical, it's structural. A great defender controls space, anticipates threats, forces opponents into predictable patterns, then exploits those patterns. Replace opponents with enemy armies, and you've described half of military strategy since humans started organizing violence. But there's something else, something harder to quantify. Maldini played 25 years at elite level and received 3 yellow cards total. 3. In a quarter century of top-flight football against the best attackers in history. He didn't need to foul because he was already where he needed to be. Perfect positioning eliminates desperation. Desperation causes fouls. No desperation, no fouls. Translate that to warfare. A commander who doesn't need desperate last stands because he's prepared for every contingency, who doesn't waste troops on panic responses because he's 3 moves ahead, who never gets caught with his forces out of position because he understands how space and time interact on a battlefield. Now imagine that mind-analyzing Napoleon's Italian campaign. Milan in 1796 is the crown jewel of Austrian holdings in Italy. Rich, strategically positioned, culturally significant, the kind of prize that makes or breaks campaigns. Historically, it falls to Napoleon in May after minimal resistance. The Austrian forces defending it make predictable moves. Napoleon counters each one effortlessly. The city surrenders without a serious siege. But what if Milan's defense isn't commanded by Austrian generals following doctrine written 50 years ago? What if it's commanded by someone who thinks like Maldini? First thing that changes: intelligence gathering. Maldini's defensive genius started with information. He studied opponents obsessively, knew their tendencies, their favorite moves, their weaknesses under pressure. Applied to warfare, this means scout networks that actually function. Spies who report useful information instead of what commanders want to hear. A clear picture of where Napoleon is, where he's going, what he's doing. Austrian intelligence in Italy was laughably bad. They consistently lost track of Napoleon's forces, underestimated his speed, misread his intentions. A Maldini-style defense fixes this immediately. You can't position yourself perfectly against threats you can't see. So you build systems that see everything. Second, understanding that defense isn't passive. This might be the biggest misconception about Maldini's style. People saw him rarely diving into tackles and assumed he was conservative, defensive, reactive. Completely wrong. He was proactive. He shaped what attackers could do before they tried to do it, controlled their options, made the dangerous passes impossible and the safe passes useless. Applied to defending Milan. You don't sit behind walls waiting for Napoleon to show up. You force him to approach from directions you've prepared for. You make his preferred tactics expensive. You turn his speed into a liability by ensuring rapid advances leave him overextended. Austrian defenders in Italy kept trying to match Napoleon's speed. Impossible. His troops moved faster, his logistics worked better, his decision-making happened in real time, while Austrian commanders waited for permission from Vienna. You can't beat someone at their own game when they invented that game, but you can refuse to play it. You can make them play yours instead. Maldini never tried to outrun faster attackers. He didn't need to. He took away the space they needed to use that speed, made them come to him in situations where speed didn't matter, turned their strength into irrelevance through positioning and patience. Now apply that to stopping Napoleon's advance on Milan. You know he's coming. You know he moves fast, concentrates forces, hits hard at decisive points. So you don't give him decisive points to hit. You defend in depth, multiple fallback positions, each one prepared, each one capable of independent resistance. He can't concentrate everything against all of them simultaneously. When he commits to breaking one position, you're already pulling back to the next, not retreating in panic, withdrawing according to plan, forcing him to waste time and energy on victories that don't actually gain him anything strategic. Meanwhile, his supply lines stretch, his troops tire, his advantage in speed becomes a disadvantage in sustainability. This isn't revolutionary military theory, it's basic defense in depth. But it requires something Austrian commanders consistently fail to demonstrate: the discipline to trade space for time, the confidence to look like you're losing while actually controlling the pace of engagement. Maldini made world-class attackers look ordinary by giving them exactly what they thought they wanted, then making it useless. He'd let them have the ball in positions where they couldn't hurt him. Let them make the pass they wanted to make, which happened to be exactly the pass he'd prepared for. They'd complete their move and suddenly realize they'd accomplished nothing. That's the mental shift defending Milan needs. Stop trying to prevent Napoleon from advancing. Let him advance into positions you've prepared. Let him think he's winning right up until he realizes he's exhausted his advantage for minimal gain. Third element, using the terrain. Milan sits in the Po Valley, surrounded by rivers, the Po itself, the Adda, the Ticino. Natural defensive barriers everywhere if you know how to use them. Austrian defenders treated these like obstacles to work around. A Maldini-style defense treats them like teammates. Rivers aren't just barriers. They're channels that force movement into predictable patterns. You know where armies can cross. You know where they can't. So you prepare the crossing points, not to hold them forever, to make crossing expensive, to slow the advance, to create kill zones where concentrated forces become vulnerable targets. Watch Maldini defend against a counterattack. He doesn't commit to stopping it at the first challenge. He shepherds it, guides it, reduces options, forces the attacker toward positions where teammates can help, uses the touchline like another defender. The attacker thinks they're still dangerous right up until they realize they're trapped. Rivers in the Po Valley become touchlines. Napoleon's forces are the counterattack. You shepherd them toward crossings you've prepared. Make them think they're choosing their route while you're actually choosing it for them. When they commit to crossing, that's when you hit them, not before, not after, at the exact moment when they're most vulnerable. Fourth, the psychological element. Maldini got into attackers' heads, made them doubt themselves, made them choose safe options even when risky ones were available, because they'd learned that risks against Maldini usually failed. After a half hour of perfect positioning and successful interventions, even elite attackers started second-guessing themselves. Napoleon's genius partly came from psychological dominance. He expected to win. His troops expected to win. That expectation became self-fulfilling as enemies defeated themselves through fear and doubt before fighting even started. His reputation did half his work for him. But what happens when that reputation meets resistance that doesn't crack? When his usual tactics hit defense that's prepared for them? When his speed advantage gets neutralized by depth? When his concentration of force keeps hitting positions his enemies have already abandoned according to plan? Doubt creeps in, not immediately. Napoleon's not fragile. But over time, as easy victories become grinding slogs, as his troops exhaust themselves taking empty positions, as his supply situation worsens while defenders stay fresh behind prepared lines, the psychological advantage shifts. This is exactly what Maldini did to strikers. Made them work incredibly hard for nothing. Made their best moves look ordinary. Made them question whether they were as good as they thought. By the end of matches, world-class attackers were taking safe options against Milan because Maldini had convinced them the risky ones wouldn't work. Now imagine Napoleon facing that across an entire campaign. His usual blitzkrieg hits prepared defense that absorbs the impact and keeps functioning. His decisive battles keep not being decisive because enemies won't commit to fighting them on his terms. His speed keeps proving useless because defenders are already where they need to be. The historical Napoleon never faced this in Italy. Austrian commanders obligingly fought the way he wanted them to fight, made the mistakes he expected them to make, broke when he expected them to break. He won because they lost, not just because he was brilliant. Against defense, organized around Maldini's principles, something different happens. Not necessarily defeat. Napoleon was genuinely exceptional, but difficulty, friction, the kind of grinding campaign that exhausted French advantages and gave Italian states time to actually organize resistance. And here's where it gets really interesting. Maldini's greatest talent wasn't individual brilliance. It was making everyone around him better. The Milan defensive unit didn't just have a great left back. It had a perfectly organized system where every player understood their role and trusted their teammates. Maldini orchestrated that, communicated constantly, adjusted in real time, turned good defenders into a great defense through leadership and tactical clarity. Applied to commanding armies defending Milan, This might be the most important factor. Italian states in 1796 had troops. They had resources. What they lacked was coordination, unity, clear command structure that transcended regional rivalries and competing interests. They fought as separate entities pursuing separate goals. A Maldini-style commander changes that, not through charisma or political maneuvering, through competence, through demonstrating that the system works, through making subordinate commanders look good by putting them in positions to succeed, through clear communication about what everyone's supposed to do and why. Watch Milan's defense during Maldini's prime. Every player knew where everyone else would be, knew who had responsibility for what space, knew when to press and when to hold. That knowledge came from leadership that communicated effectively and positioned people correctly. Individual talent mattered, but system mattered more. Italian defense in 1796 desperately needed that systematic approach, needed someone who could take disparate forces from different states with different training and different goals, then weld them into something coherent. Not by making everyone the same, by giving everyone clear roles that worked together. Austrian attempts at unified command failed because they imposed rigid hierarchy on forces that resented foreign control. A defender from Milan, commanding Milan's defense with a proven system that works, that's different. That's someone locals might actually listen to, because success speaks louder than rank. But there's a crucial limitation to acknowledge here. Maldini defended for Milan, one of the richest clubs in the world, with resources that made his job easier. He had world-class teammates, elite training facilities, everything he needed to succeed. Take away those advantages, and even genius struggles. Milan in 1796 isn't poor, but it's not endless resources either. The Italian campaign. Part 1 requires understanding what's actually possible with what's available, not fantasizing about perfect scenarios. A Maldini-style defense of Milan works with real limitations, real constraints, real problems. The Austrian forces nominally defending northern Italy numbered around 30,000 in the Milan region when Napoleon arrived. Reasonable size. The problem wasn't quantity, it was quality of command, organization, and strategic thinking. Those are exactly the areas where Maldini's approach creates value without requiring massive new resources. So part 2 will dive into the specific opening moves. Napoleon crosses into Italy in late March 1796. His forces split Austrian and Piedmontese armies at Montenotte in April. Historically, this is where Italian resistance collapses. But if Milan's defense is organized differently, understands what's coming, has prepared the terrain, and positioned forces according to principles that actually work against Napoleon's style, then those opening battles look very different. The question isn't whether Maldini magically defeats Napoleon through defensive brilliance alone. The question is whether proper defensive organization creates enough difficulty, enough delay, enough friction that the entire campaign changes character. Word count, 2,188. That question frames everything about the Italian campaign's opening moves. Because historically, Napoleon's first victories weren't brilliant tactical masterpieces. They were efficient exploitations of terrible defensive positioning. Montenotte, Millesimo, Dego. These battles succeed because Austrian and Piedmontese forces are scattered, poorly coordinated, and positioned to defend territory rather than deny Napoleon's strategic objectives. A Maldini-style defense doesn't make those mistakes. Start with terrain. Northern Italy in 1796 is mountainous along the coast where Napoleon enters, then opens into the Po Valley. Historically, Austrian forces try defending mountain passes while simultaneously protecting the plains. Classic error. Trying to defend everything means defending nothing effectively. Maldini's approach would recognize this immediately. You can't prevent Napoleon from entering Italy. The Ligurian Alps aren't impenetrable. But you can force him to enter on your terms, into positions where his advantages diminish, and your preparation matters. The key is understanding what Napoleon wants. He needs to separate Austrian and Piemontese forces, defeat them individually, then drive toward Milan and Vienna. His strategy requires mobility, concentration of force at decisive points, and keeping enemies off balance. Everything about his approach demands space to maneuver and opponents who react to his moves rather than forcing him to react to theirs. Proper defense denies him those conditions. Geographically, Napoleon has to move through specific corridors. The coastal route through Savona toward Genoa, or inland routes through mountain passes toward Piedmont and Lombardy. Historically, defenders spread forces trying to block all possible routes. Terrible decision. Napoleon simply concentrates against whichever point is weakest, breaks through, then the entire defensive line collapses because everyone's out of position. Maldini's defending Milan knows that's coming, knows Napoleon will probe multiple points to find weakness. The defensive response isn't spreading thin, trying to hold everywhere. It's identifying the routes that actually threaten Milan's strategic position, fortifying those heavily, then positioning mobile reserves to respond wherever Napoleon commits his main force. You're not trying to stop him at the border. You're forcing him to reveal his intentions, then making his chosen route as costly as possible. Late March 1796, Napoleon's army of Italy crosses into Piedmontese territory. About 40,000 men, undersupplied, unpaid, hungry. Historically, that hunger drives aggressive action because they need to live off the land. Defensive forces that retreat too quickly let Napoleon's army feed itself from captured supplies. Forces that stand and fight in prepared positions make that feeding process expensive. The Austrian commander, General Beaulieu, positions forces to defend Genoa and protect the road to Milan. Piemontese forces under Colli defend their own territory. Neither coordinates effectively with the other. Napoleon exploits that gap at Montenotte on April 12th, catches an Austrian division isolated, defeats it decisively. The victory isn't about tactical brilliance, it's about Austrian forces being exactly where they shouldn't be, doing exactly what they shouldn't do. Now imagine Maldini's organizing this defense. First principle, acknowledge what you can't prevent. You can't stop Napoleon from crossing the border. You can't defend all of Piedmont and Liguria. Those are Piedmontese problems. Your job is defending Milan, which means controlling the approaches to Lombardy. That clarity changes everything. Second principle, make the enemy commit before you do. Historically, Austrian forces commit to defensive positions before Napoleon even arrives, then can't adjust when he attacks unexpected points. Maldini's approach maintains flexibility. You position screening forces to observe and delay, but your main strength stays mobile and uncommitted until Napoleon reveals where he's actually going. When he concentrates for attack, you're already moving reserves to reinforce that sector. Third principle, terrain is your friend when you use it correctly. The mountains between Liguria and Lombardy aren't impenetrable, but they channel movement. Limited roads, narrow valleys, positions where small forces can delay larger ones if they're prepared and supported. Historically, defenders abandon these positions too quickly after initial contact. Maldini's defense holds them longer because the system supports them. They're not isolated outposts wondering if help will arrive. They're part of a coordinated defense with clear communication about when to hold and when to withdraw. April 1796 unfolds differently. Napoleon still attacks at Montenotte because that's his style. Fast, aggressive, hitting what looks like a weak point. But instead of finding an isolated Austrian division that collapses after brief fighting, he finds a prepared position with clear withdrawal routes to secondary positions. The Austrian force there isn't trying to hold indefinitely. They're buying time while inflicting casualties, then falling back to the next defensive line. Napoleon takes the position, that's not in question, but taking it costs more time and more casualties than historically. His supply situation is already terrible. Every day matters, every casualty matters. The quick knockout punch becomes a grinding advance against an enemy that won't panic and won't stay in positions where they can be destroyed. The psychological impact matters here. Napoleon's army in April 1796 is on the edge, hungry, unpaid, skeptical of their young commander who keeps promising victories that will solve all problems. Those early victories at Montenotte, Millesimo, Dago create momentum that carries the entire campaign. Soldiers start believing, start fighting harder because they're winning. That momentum is fragile early on. Make those victories harder, more costly, less decisive, and the psychological dynamic shifts. Millesimo comes next, historically on April 13th. Napoleon defeats another Austrian force, then Piedmontese forces at Dago on April 14th to 15th. 3 victories in 4 days, devastating for Allied morale. Beaulieu retreats toward Milan. Colli retreats toward Turin. The campaign's basically over by late April because Italian resistance has collapsed psychologically. But if Montenotte isn't a crushing victory, if Austrian forces withdraw in good order while making Napoleon pay for every mile, then Millesimo and Dago look different. Napoleon still attacks, still probably wins those battles. But winning means pushing back organized resistance that retreats to prepared positions rather than scattering in panic. The French army is advancing, yes, but they're also getting tired, running low on ammunition, still not getting paid or fed properly. There's a crucial decision point here for the Piedmontese. Historically, after those early defeats, they negotiate an armistice with Napoleon in late April, completely abandons the Austrians, gives Napoleon free passage through their territory. That armistice is disastrous for Milan because it lets Napoleon concentrate entirely on Austrian forces without worrying about his flanks or rear. Maldini defending Milan has to prevent that armistice, or at least delay it. The way you do that is by making the military situation look less hopeless for Piedmont. If Austrian forces are retreating but not collapsing, if French victories are costing Napoleon significant casualties and time, then Piedmont has reason to keep fighting. They might believe coordinated resistance could actually work. This requires something that didn't exist historically: trust between Austrian and Piedmontese commanders. That trust comes from demonstrated competence, from Austrian forces actually doing what they say they'll do, from coordination that works instead of breaking down under pressure. Maldini's systematic approach creates that trust not through diplomacy, but through performance. Watch how this might work tactically. Napoleon's trying to separate Austrian and Piedmontese forces so he can defeat them individually. His movements aim at creating gaps between their armies. Historically, those gaps appear because neither side trusts the other to hold their positions or support properly. Austrian commanders expect Piedmontese forces to collapse. Piedmontese commanders expect Austrians to retreat and abandon them. Neither expectation is wrong based on historical experience. Change those expectations through demonstrated reliability and the entire dynamic shifts. When Austrian forces say they'll hold a position and actually do it effectively, Piedmontese forces stop assuming they'll be abandoned. When Austrian retreats are organized and covered by rearguards that function properly, Piedmontese commanders see a system that works rather than chaos. Napoleon's genius partly lies in exploiting enemy mistakes and psychological weakness. Remove some of those mistakes and he has to work harder. He's still Napoleon. He'll find solutions, but solutions take time, cost casualties, and create friction that accumulates. The geography of northern Italy creates natural defensive lines if you use them correctly. The Po River is the major one. Historically, Austrian forces retreat past it too quickly, giving up strong defensive terrain. But before the Po, there are smaller rivers and ridge lines that can be defended in succession, not trying to hold each one indefinitely, using each to delay, inflict casualties, then withdraw to the next. This is where Maldini's zonal defending concept becomes directly applicable. In football, zonal defending means controlling space rather than marking individual players. You're not chasing the ball, you're maintaining defensive shape, forcing opponents into areas where you're strong, denying them space in dangerous areas. Applied to military defense, it means controlling key terrain and forcing Napoleon to attack where your preparation gives you advantages. Napoleon wants fluid battles where his superior tactical skill and aggressive subordinates can exploit opportunities. Proper defensive organization denies him those opportunities by not creating the gaps and mistakes he exploits. You're not trying to outmaneuver Napoleon. You're making maneuver less valuable by maintaining solid defensive positions with proper support and clear withdrawal routes. The historical battles of April 1796 succeed for Napoleon, partly because Austrian forces panic and break after initial contact. They're not prepared psychologically or tactically for the intensity of French attacks. Junior officers don't know what to do when their seniors are killed or wounded. Units lose cohesion and retreat becomes rout. Maldini's approach prevents that through preparation and clear communication. Every unit knows what their job is, knows where to withdraw if forced back, knows what signals mean and who's in command if leaders fall. That preparation doesn't make soldiers braver, but it makes panic less likely because there's a system to fall back on instead of chaos. By late April, historically, the campaign is effectively over. Piedmont signs the Armistice of Cherasco. Austrian forces are retreating toward Milan in disorder. Napoleon's chasing them, winning small victories, building momentum. The French army is still hungry and unpaid, but victories provide loot and hope. In a better defended scenario, late April looks different. Piedmont hasn't surrendered because the military situation isn't hopeless. Austrian forces are still cohesive and fighting effectively. Napoleon's advanced into Italy, yes, but at significant cost in time and casualties. His supply situation is critical. His soldiers are still unpaid. The easy victories that create momentum haven't materialized. This is where the campaign's strategic timeline becomes crucial. Napoleon historically reaches Milan in mid-May and occupies it with minimal resistance. That's about 6 weeks from when the campaign starts. Those 6 weeks include decisive battles, an armistice, and a pursuit. Very fast pace. If proper defense adds even 2 weeks to that timeline, everything changes. 2 weeks means Napoleon's army gets hungrier, more exhausted. Casualty lists grow longer. Disease from poor conditions starts affecting strength. The political situation in Paris starts questioning whether this Italian adventure is worth the cost. 2 weeks gives Austrian reinforcements time to arrive from other theatres, gives Milan time to prepare better defences of the city itself. Milan in 1796 isn't heavily fortified. It's a commercial city, not a fortress. Historically, it falls without serious resistance because Austrian forces have already retreated past it. But if the defensive campaign has been more effective, if Austrian forces are still cohesive and positioned to defend Milan rather than fleeing through it, then the city becomes a serious obstacle. Defending cities is different from defending in the field. Urban terrain favours defenders if they're prepared. Buildings create cover. Streets channel attacks. Prepared positions can exact heavy casualties from attackers who have to advance through confined spaces. Napoleon can besiege Milan, but sieges take time and resources he doesn't have in abundance. The real question becomes whether Napoleon's army can sustain offensive operations long enough to achieve decisive victory before their own weaknesses become critical. Historically, they could because resistance collapsed quickly. Against organized defense that makes them pay for every advance, the calculation changes. There's another factor that matters here: the political situation in Milan and Lombardy generally. Historically, many Italians welcome Napoleon as a liberator from Austrian rule. That welcome smooths his occupation and provides resources. But if the Austrian defense has been more effective, if it's protected Italian territories better, then maybe that welcome is less enthusiastic. Maybe Lombards see Austrian forces as defenders rather than oppressors. This is speculative, obviously. Political attitudes don't change overnight based on military performance alone. But they're not fixed either. A defense that actually functions, that protects civilians, that shows competence and concern for Italian welfare, creates different perceptions than the historically incompetent Austrian performance. Maldini defending Milan isn't just about tactical positioning. It's about demonstrating that the system works, that defenders are reliable, that Austrian command can be trusted to do what it says it will do. Those perceptions matter politically and militarily because they affect everything from civilian cooperation to soldier morale. By early May in this alternative timeline, Napoleon's facing problems he didn't encounter historically. His advance has been slower, his casualties higher, his supply situation worse. The political boost from quick victories hasn't materialized. And now he's approaching Milan, which is actually prepared to defend itself rather than surrendering at first sight of French troops. The siege of Milan, if it happens, becomes the campaign's turning point. Let's walk through what that looks like. Napoleon arrives outside Milan in mid-May with roughly 30,000 troops. Historically, those troops are already showing wear. 6 weeks of constant marching and fighting have thinned the ranks through combat casualties, disease, and desertion. Supplies are inconsistent. Pay is non-existent. The army's effectiveness depends entirely on momentum and morale, both of which come from winning. Against historical opposition, that's sufficient. Against prepared defense in urban terrain, it's marginal. Maldini's inside Milan with perhaps 15,000 defenders. Mixed Austrian regulars and whatever Italian militia can be organized and trusted. The city itself isn't naturally defensible like a fortress, but it has advantages. Stone buildings provide strong points. Streets can be barricaded. Church towers offer observation posts. The defensive perimeter is large, which spreads defenders thin, but it also means attackers can't concentrate force effectively everywhere at once. Napoleon's first problem is reconnaissance. He needs to understand the defensive layout before committing to assault. That takes time. Days at minimum, possibly a week or more if defenders actively contest French probing. Every day spent in reconnaissance is a day without food being delivered to hungry troops. A day Austrian reinforcements might be approaching. A day Paris might be questioning whether this campaign was wise. The second problem is logistics. Besieging a city requires establishing secure supply lines to your own base while cutting the enemy's supply lines. Napoleon's supply lines run back through territory that's only nominally controlled. Foraging has stripped nearby areas already. Bringing supplies from France means long, vulnerable convoys through potentially hostile territory. Milan's supply lines run to Austrian-controlled territories that are closer and more secure. Time favors defenders here. Third problem is assault preparation. Taking a defended city without siege artillery means infantry assaults against prepared positions. That's costly. Napoleon has some artillery, but not siege guns designed for reducing fortifications. His guns are field pieces meant for open battle. They can damage buildings, but systematically reducing defensive positions takes time and ammunition he may not have in abundance. So Napoleon faces a choice: quick assault with whatever forces and artillery he has, accepting heavy casualties in exchange for speed, or methodical siege, which conserves lives but burns time and resources. Neither option is good when you're operating on a shoestring, and momentum is everything. Let's say he chooses assault. That's consistent with his aggressive temperament and the campaign's strategic imperatives. He can't afford to sit outside Milan for weeks while his army deteriorates. He needs decisive action. The assault planning takes several days, identifying weak points in the defences, positioning artillery to support infantry attacks, organizing assault columns, stockpiling ammunition, preparing medical facilities for the casualties everyone knows are coming. Meanwhile, defenders are strengthening positions, stockpiling ammunition, rotating troops to maintain readiness. When the assault comes, it's brutal. Urban combat always is. French troops advance through streets under fire from windows and rooftops. Buildings that seem empty suddenly reveal defenders. Barricades channel attacks into killing zones. Every intersection is a potential ambush. Artillery can suppress some positions, but not all, and not without destroying the city Napoleon wants to occupy intact. Casualties mount quickly. Not the catastrophic losses of a completely failed assault, but steady attrition that eats into French strength. An assault column might take a building block after heavy fighting, only to face another defensive line behind it. The defensive depth that Maldini has presumably organized means there's no single breakthrough point where French success collapses the entire defense. After a day or two of this, Napoleon has to reassess. He's making progress, but slower than needed, and at higher cost than sustainable. His casualties are approaching 15, maybe 20%. Not enough to break the army, but enough to seriously degrade combat effectiveness. And he's not through the defenses yet. This is where leadership decisions become critical. Does Napoleon commit to continuing the assault, gambling that one more push will break through? Does he shift to siege operations, accepting the time cost? Or does he negotiate? That third option is interesting because it's not something Napoleon historically needs to consider in Italy. He's winning too decisively for negotiation to make sense from his position. But here, with the assault stalling and costs mounting, negotiation might be rational. Not surrender, but terms that get him into Milan without destroying his army in the process. Maldini's position in negotiations would be interesting. He's defended successfully, inflicted real costs, demonstrated that Austrian forces can fight effectively. But he's also isolated. Reinforcements might be coming, but they're not here yet. His supplies are finite, his troops have fought hard and may not sustain another major assault. A negotiated settlement that preserves the army while giving up the city might be acceptable. What would such negotiations look like? Napoleon needs Milan's resources and the political victory of occupying Lombardy's capital. Maldini needs his army to survive as a fighting force. Possible compromise. Austrian forces evacuate Milan but remain intact, withdrawing in good order to prepared positions further east. Napoleon occupies the city but doesn't destroy the defending army. Both sides preserve their core interests. Of course, negotiations might fail. They often do when both sides still think they can win militarily. But the possibility exists in a way it doesn't historically, because the military situation is genuinely balanced rather than completely one-sided. Let's say negotiations do fail, and Napoleon commits to continuing the assault. He's now been outside Milan for perhaps 10 days. His army has suffered maybe 5,000 casualties. Supply situation is deteriorating, and he's about to commit to another major assault that will cost thousands more. The second assault is even harder than the first because defenders have learned from the initial fighting. They know which approaches work for French attackers and have adjusted defenses accordingly. They've identified which positions are critical and reinforced them. They've developed better coordination between different defensive sectors. Experience matters, and they've gained it. French troops, meanwhile, are exhausted. Constant marching before the siege. Days of combat during the first assault. Inadequate food and rest between assaults. Casualty lists that have removed many experienced soldiers and officers. Morale that depends on winning, but is facing determined resistance. This isn't the army that started the campaign 6 weeks ago. It's worn down. The second assault might succeed. Numbers and aggression can overcome a lot, and Napoleon's tactical skill in concentrating force at decisive points is considerable. But success here looks different from historical success. Instead of walking into Milan after token resistance, French forces fight building by building, street by street. Instead of minimal casualties, they lose perhaps a quarter of their strength. Instead of rapid occupation, they spend 2 weeks reducing the city. By the time Milan falls in this scenario, it's late May or early June. Napoleon's army has perhaps 25,000 effectives from the original 35,000 who started the campaign. They're exhausted, undersupplied, and occupying a city that's been partially destroyed in the fighting. The political boost from occupying Milan is real, but muted by the cost and time required. And the strategic situation has changed fundamentally. Those 2 weeks fighting for Milan gave Austrian forces throughout Italy time to reorganize. Reinforcements from other theatres have arrived or are arriving. The defensive network that should have been established from the start is now being built while Napoleon's army recovers from the Milan fighting. The timeline for French conquest of northern Italy has been disrupted in ways that matter enormously for subsequent operations. There's another scenario where Milan doesn't fall at all, where the assault costs become unsustainable and Napoleon has to withdraw. That's less likely because French advantages in numbers and artillery are real. But it's not impossible if casualties mount high enough and Austrian reinforcements arrive at the right moment. A failed siege of Milan would be catastrophic for Napoleon's career and the entire French strategic position in Italy. But let's assume Milan falls, because even with better defense, that's the most likely outcome. The question is what happens next? Historically, Napoleon spends the rest of 1796 consolidating his hold on northern Italy, fighting several more battles against Austrian forces, besieging Mantua, and eventually forcing Austria to negotiate. That all flows from the quick, decisive victories in April and May that shatter Austrian resistance and create momentum for further French advances. In this alternative timeline, that momentum doesn't exist. Milan falls, but at a cost that makes further offensive operations questionable. Napoleon's army needs rest, reinforcements, supplies. The political situation in Paris is less supportive because the campaign has been expensive without delivering the quick, cheap victories that were promised. Austrian forces are reorganizing behind defensive positions while waiting for reinforcements. The campaign enters a new phase, not the mobile warfare of the historical April-May period, not the siege operations of the historical Mantua campaign later in the year, something in between. A positional campaign where both sides maneuver for advantage while avoiding decisive battles that could destroy their armies. French trying to expand their control of Lombardy, Austrians trying to contain French gains while building strength for eventual counteroffensive. This kind of campaign is exactly what Napoleon doesn't want. His advantages are in mobility and decisive battle. His weaknesses are in logistics and sustained operations. A slow positional campaign favors the side with better supply lines and reinforcement capability. That's Austria, not France. The political implications ripple beyond Italy. France in 1796 is fighting multiple wars simultaneously. The Italian campaign is important, but so are operations against Austria in Germany and against Britain at sea. Resources are limited. If Italy bogs down into expensive positional warfare, Paris starts questioning whether those resources should be redirected. Maybe the German front offers better prospects. Maybe peace negotiations become attractive. Austria's calculation changes too. Historically, they keep fighting Napoleon in Italy through 1796 and into 1797, despite repeated defeats, because they're not ready to concede Lombardy. But they're also not willing to commit unlimited resources to a theatre where they're clearly losing. In this alternative timeline, they're not clearly losing. They've fought effectively. Milan was expensive for France. Their armies are intact and improving. Committing more resources to Italy starts looking rational rather than throwing good money after bad. The summer of 1796 in this timeline might see both sides building up forces in northern Italy while manoeuvring for position, neither wanting to risk their army in a decisive battle, both trying to improve their situation for eventual negotiations or resume defensive operations. It's not dramatic, it's not the stuff of legend, but it's probably what happens when defensive improvements prevent the kind of decisive offensive victory that Napoleon achieved historically. There's a broader question lurking here about whether Napoleon becomes Napoleon without the Italian campaign's historical success. His reputation, his political power, his eventual path to ruling France, all of that flows from 1796 to 97 in Italy. If those campaigns bog down, if he's just another general fighting inconclusive battles and sieges, if the costs are high and the gains modest, does he still rise to power? That's beyond our scope for analysing defensive improvements, but it matters for understanding why this alternative timeline is significant. We're not just talking about tactical or operational changes. We're talking about strategic and political consequences that could reshape European history, all from the relatively simple proposition that Austrian forces defend competently instead of incompetently. The Milan siege, whether it succeeds quickly, slowly, or fails entirely, becomes the moment where timeline divergence becomes undeniable. Before Milan, you can imagine things converging back toward history despite defensive improvements. Better Austrian performance at Montenotte and Dago, but still eventual French victory. After Milan, the divergence is locked in. The campaign's character has changed fundamentally. The timeline is different. The strategic situation is different. The political dynamics are different. Which brings us to the question that determines everything else. What happens next? Not in some abstract strategic sense. In the immediate tactical reality of late spring 1796, where actual armies occupy actual positions and need to make actual decisions about where to move and what to fight for. The French are outside Milan, with an army that's taken casualties, not catastrophic losses, but real attrition from weeks of campaigning and a siege that cost more than expected. Their supply situation is strained because they're operating at the end of logistics lines that stretch back through hostile territory to bases in France. Napoleon's army lives off the land to some extent, but you can't sustain a major force indefinitely through requisitions and looting alone. Austrian forces have fallen back from Milan, but they're not destroyed. They've maintained unit cohesion through competent defensive fighting. Their morale isn't broken because they haven't been repeatedly routed in the field. They've lost territory, but they've preserved their army as a functioning military instrument capable of offensive or defensive operations. The strategic map of northern Italy in this timeline looks different than it did historically. French control extends to Milan and the western portions of Lombardy. But Austrian positions in the east are stronger. The fortresses that historically fell quickly are better prepared and more capable of sustained resistance. The population in areas under Austrian control hasn't lost confidence in their army's ability to defend them, so both commanders face choices. Napoleon's historical response to this kind of situation was usually aggressive. Push forward, seek battle, destroy enemy forces before they can reorganize. His entire operational art is built around maintaining initiative through constant offensive action. But that approach works when you're winning decisively, when your victories are clear and your enemies are demoralized. In this timeline, neither of those conditions fully applies. He could continue east from Milan toward Venice and the Austrian frontier. That's the historical direction. But it means leaving potentially hostile fortresses in his rear. It means extending supply lines even further through territory that's not securely pacified. It means risking battle with Austrian forces that have shown they can fight effectively. Alternatively, he could consolidate. Secure his hold on western Lombardy. Reduce the fortresses that still resist. Build up supplies and reinforcements before pushing further. It's the cautious option. The un-Napoleonic option. But it might be the smart option when your initial offensive has achieved less than expected and cost more than planned. The Austrian commander faces the mirror image decision. Pull back further and defend Venice? Counterattack while French forces are extended and potentially vulnerable after the Milan siege. Maneuver for position while waiting for reinforcements from the main Austrian army. Historically, this choice didn't really exist because French victories were so complete that Austrian options collapsed to retreat and try to survive. In this timeline, real options exist, which means the campaign's next phase depends on command decisions rather than being predetermined by prior disasters. Let's game out the aggressive French option first. Napoleon pushes east from Milan without pausing to consolidate. He's gambling that Austrian forces, despite fighting better than historically, aren't strong enough to stop a determined French offensive. He's betting that his advantages in mobility and battlefield tactics still give him the edge in open warfare, even if defensive positions are harder to crack. This leads to a campaign across the Venetian plain toward the Austrian frontier. Historically, this was the Mantua campaign, where Napoleon besieged the fortress of Mantua while defeating multiple Austrian relief attempts. It was a defining phase of the 1796 campaign that established Napoleon's reputation for operational brilliance. In our timeline, it's more complicated. The Austrian forces retreating from Milan aren't demoralized stragglers. They're organized units that can fight defensively while falling back. They contest river crossings. They occupy strong positions that force the French to deploy and fight rather than just marching forward. They make the French pay for every advance in time and casualties. This doesn't mean the French lose battles. Napoleon is still Napoleon. His tactical skill, his artillery handling, his ability to find and exploit enemy weaknesses, all of that remains superior to his opponents. But battles are harder. Victories are narrower. The pace of advance is slower. Meanwhile, the Austrian high command is making different decisions than they did historically. They're not writing off Italy as a lost cause. They're seeing reports of competent defensive fighting and French difficulties. They're thinking maybe Italy can be held with sufficient reinforcement. Troops that historically went to other fronts might come to Italy instead. Resources that were allocated elsewhere might be redirected. The political calculation changes when you're reinforcing potential success, rather than trying to salvage disaster. So the campaign across the Venetian plain becomes a running fight. French advancing, Austrians contesting, both sides maneuvering for advantage. It's not the decisive mobile warfare that Napoleon excels at. It's not the static positional fighting that nullifies his advantages. It's something in between. The key moment comes at Mantua. Historically, Mantua was the strategic anchor of Austrian defense in Italy, a fortress city on marshy ground that the French besieged for 8 months while defeating 4 separate Austrian relief attempts. It was the campaign's decisive point. Austrian failure to relieve Mantua meant losing Italy. French success in holding the siege while defeating relief forces demonstrated Napoleon's operational genius. In this timeline, Mantua is better prepared. The garrison is larger because Austrian forces falling back from Milan include troops that historically were captured or dispersed. The fortifications are in better condition because maintenance wasn't neglected during the long peace. Supply stockpiles are adequate for extended resistance because logistics planning anticipated potential siege. More importantly, the Austrian relief attempts are better organized. The field armies approaching Mantua aren't just scratch forces assembled in panic. They're properly constituted formations with clear operational plans based on competent intelligence about French positions and capabilities. This creates a fundamentally different operational problem for Napoleon. Historically, he could contain Mantua with a screening force while concentrating against each Austrian relief attempt in turn. His interior lines and superior mobility let him defeat enemies piecemeal before they could unite. The siege continued while he fought and won separate battles against each relief column. In this timeline, that approach is riskier. The siege of Mantua requires more French forces because the garrison is stronger and more active. The relief attempts are better coordinated and harder to defeat in detail. Austrian commanders have learned from earlier French successes and are avoiding the mistakes that led to those victories. Napoleon faces a choice. Commit enough force to maintain the siege while having enough mobile strength to defeat relief attempts. Or lift the siege temporarily to deal with relief forces, then resume it afterward. Or abandon the siege entirely and seek battle with Austrian field armies in the open. Each option has problems. Maintaining the siege while fighting relief attempts spreads French forces thin. It risks defeat in detail if Austrian coordination is good. It strains already stressed logistics because you're supporting both siege operations and mobile warfare simultaneously. Lifting the siege temporarily means giving the garrison time to rest and resupply. It means admitting you can't accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. It shows weakness that encourages further Austrian resistance. Abandoning the siege means giving up the strategic key to northern Italy. It means accepting that you can't reduce Austrian strongholds while also fighting mobile campaigns. It represents a fundamental admission that this campaign isn't going as planned. Historically, Napoleon chose option 1 and made it work through operational brilliance. In this timeline, with stronger Austrian resistance and better defensive preparation, that same choice might lead to very different results. Imagine a scenario where Napoleon concentrates against an Austrian relief force, defeats it in a hard-fought battle, but returns to Mantua to find the garrison has sortied and damaged or destroyed the siege works. Or where a second relief force arrives while he's engaged with the first and he can't defeat both simultaneously. Or where the siege drags on for months, consuming resources while achieving nothing decisive. Any of these outcomes fundamentally changes the campaign's character. They transform it from a triumphant offensive that conquers northern Italy into an inconclusive struggle that consumes resources without achieving strategic objectives. The political implications cascade rapidly. Paris is watching the Italian campaign with great interest, but also with awareness that France is fighting on multiple fronts. Resources committed to Italy can't be used in Germany or against Britain. If Italy is winning decisively, those resources are well spent. If Italy is bogged down in expensive, inconclusive fighting, redirecting those resources starts looking attractive. Napoleon's political position in this timeline is weaker than it was historically. He's still a successful general, but he's not the miracle worker who conquered Italy in a single brilliant campaign. He's the commander who took Milan at considerable cost and then got stuck in a grinding operational struggle around Mantua. That matters enormously for his future trajectory. Historically, the Italian campaign's success gave him political capital to pursue independent policies and eventually overthrow the Directory. In this timeline, he's more dependent on political support from Paris, more vulnerable to being replaced if results don't meet expectations, less able to dictate terms. Austria's political calculation shifts too. Historically, they kept fighting Napoleon in Italy through repeated defeats because they weren't ready to concede Lombardy, but also couldn't figure out how to stop him. They kept throwing armies into Italy that kept getting destroyed. Eventually, they had to negotiate from weakness. In this timeline, they're fighting more effectively. They haven't lost their Italian armies. They're contesting French advances and making them costly. The strategic situation isn't favourable, but it's not catastrophic. That makes continuing the fight look more rational. It makes committing additional resources seem like reinforcing success rather than throwing good money after bad. The summer of 1796 in this timeline might see both sides building up forces in northern Italy while manoeuvring for position, neither wanting to risk everything in decisive battle, both trying to improve their situation for eventual negotiations or renewed offensive. French forces around Mantua trying to maintain siege pressure while defending against relief attempts. Austrian forces trying to relieve Mantua while avoiding the kind of decisive defeat that would collapse their position entirely. Both sides fighting battles that matter tactically, but don't resolve anything strategically. It's not dramatic. It's not the stuff of legend. But it's probably what happens when competent defense prevents the kind of decisive offensive breakthrough that Napoleon achieved historically. The operational art of this campaign becomes more about logistics and attrition than maneuver and battle. Which side can sustain operations longer? Which side's supply lines are more robust? Which side's political leadership maintains commitment when results are mixed and costs are high? Those aren't questions that favour Napoleon. His genius is in operational maneuver and tactical battle. His weaknesses are in logistics and sustained operations. A grinding campaign around Mantua plays to his weaknesses while minimizing his strengths. Austrian advantages in this kind of campaign are substantial. Their supply lines to Mantua and northern Italy are shorter than French lines back to France. Their ability to reinforce from the main Austrian army is better than French ability to reinforce from across the Alps. Their fortifications and defensive positions give them tactical advantages that offset French superiority in mobile warfare. If the campaign bogs down into this kind of grinding struggle, Austria might actually be winning even while losing territory. They're achieving the strategic goal of preventing French conquest of Italy at acceptable cost. They're maintaining their army as a viable force. They're setting conditions for eventual negotiation from a position of reasonable strength. For Napoleon, this represents strategic failure even if he's winning individual battles. His mission is to conquer Italy and force Austria to negotiate on French terms. If he's stuck besieging Mantua through summer and fall, consuming resources without achieving decisive results, he's failing strategically regardless of tactical successes. The historical turning point of the Italian campaign was the period from May through August 1796, when Napoleon besieged Mantua while defeating multiple relief attempts. Those victories established his reputation and broke Austrian power in Italy. In this timeline, that same period might be the moment where the campaign's limitations become clear, where initial French successes fail to translate into strategic victory, where improved Austrian defensive performance creates a stalemate that neither side can break without unacceptable cost. The stalemate around Mantua through summer 1796 creates ripple effects that extend far beyond northern Italy. In Paris, the Directory watches with growing concern as their most promising general fails to achieve the decisive victory they expected. The campaign is expensive, results are mixed, and the strategic situation isn't improving fast enough to justify continued heavy investment. This matters because France in 1796 faces multiple theatres and limited resources. The Rhine campaigns demand attention. The internal security situation requires forces. The financial crisis deepens daily. The Directory needs a quick, cheap victory in Italy to free up resources for other priorities. What they're getting instead is an expensive, inconclusive campaign that ties down their best general and most effective army without producing the kind of dramatic success that would justify the costs. Political pressure on Napoleon builds through summer, not to abandon the campaign, but to achieve results that match the investment, to either force a decisive breakthrough or to negotiate acceptable terms that would allow French forces to redeploy. The Directory's letters grow more pointed. Questions about timeline and costs become more frequent. Subtle hints that other generals might achieve better results with the same resources. Napoleon faces a dilemma. He can continue the methodical siege of Mantua and grinding campaign against Austrian relief forces, accepting slow progress and mounting costs. Or he can take bigger risks, seeking the kind of decisive battle that produces dramatic results, but might also produce catastrophic defeat if things go wrong. Historically, he chose aggression, attacking Austrian relief armies with bold maneuvers that risked everything but produced spectacular victories. In this timeline, that same aggressive instinct runs into improved Austrian defensive performance. The risks don't change, but the likely outcomes do. Consider what happens if Napoleon attempts one of his characteristic flanking maneuvers against an Austrian relief force in July or August 1796, and it doesn't work as planned. Not catastrophic failure, just operational outcomes that fall short of decisive success. He maneuvers around the Austrian flank, but they detect the movement and refuse battle on unfavourable terms. Or he achieves tactical surprise, but the Austrian defence prevents exploitation. Or he wins the engagement, but Austrian withdrawal prevents the kind of total victory that shatters enemy forces. Each of these outcomes is plausible with improved Austrian performance. None represents incompetence or failure by Napoleon. They're just the normal friction of war against a competent opponent who isn't making catastrophic mistakes. The cumulative effect is strategic stalemate despite tactical activity. Both sides fight multiple engagements through summer. Both achieve local successes. Neither achieves the kind of decisive result that changes the strategic situation fundamentally. For Austria, this is acceptable. Not ideal, but acceptable. They're holding Italy at costs they can sustain while maintaining their army's effectiveness. They're preventing French conquest while setting conditions for eventual negotiation. They're demonstrating that France cannot simply roll over Austrian forces through superior generalship alone. For France, this is problematic. The Directory didn't invest in the Italian campaign to achieve stalemate. They need victory, preferably cheap and quick victory. What they're getting is expensive stalemate with uncertain prospects. By late summer 1796, pressure on Napoleon to produce results or negotiate becomes intense. The Directory considers options. Could a different general do better? Should they negotiate with Austria from current positions? Should they reduce investment in Italy and prioritize other theatres? Should they give Napoleon more resources to break the stalemate? Each option has advocates and problems. Replacing Napoleon risks throwing away what's been achieved and starting over with potentially worse results. Negotiating from current positions means accepting something less than the decisive victory they wanted. Reducing investment means accepting strategic failure in Italy. Increasing investment when results are mixed seems like compounding a mistake. The political dynamics in Paris shift as summer progresses. Different factions within the Directory push different solutions. Some want to double down on Italy with more resources. Others want to cut losses and redeploy forces. Still others want to maintain current effort while pressuring Napoleon for better results. Napoleon, acutely aware of these political currents, faces his own calculations. He knows his political position depends on military success. He knows the Directory is fickle and will abandon generals who fail to deliver. He knows other ambitious generals are positioning themselves to take his place if he stumbles. This creates incentives for risk-taking, for attempting the kind of bold strokes that produce spectacular victories or spectacular failures. For gambling on decisive battle rather than accepting the slow grind of siege warfare and attrition. But here's where improved Austrian performance matters most. Napoleon can take risks, but if Austrian forces don't make the kind of mistakes that make risky maneuvers pay off, those risks become actual dangers rather than calculated gambles. Think about the historical Battle of Arcole in November 1796. Napoleon's forces were actually in a difficult situation, having failed to prevent Austrian relief of Mantua. He gambled on a bold attack across a heavily defended bridge. The attack initially failed. He personally led charges that got repulsed. The battle was a near disaster that turned into a narrow victory through sheer determination and Austrian mistakes. In this timeline, a similar situation might produce different results. Not because Napoleon does anything different, but because Austrian defensive performance doesn't break at the critical moment. The battle becomes a costly stalemate or even a tactical defeat. Not the end of the campaign, but a serious setback that changes calculations on both sides. A French tactical defeat in late 1796 doesn't mean the war ends. It means the strategic situation shifts. Austrian confidence increases. French political pressure on Napoleon intensifies. The prospect of negotiated settlement from less favorable positions becomes more real. The Directory faces a choice: continue supporting Napoleon despite setbacks, risking more resources on uncertain prospects, replace him, accepting the disruption and uncertainty that brings, negotiate with Austria, accepting something less than the decisive victory they wanted. The decision depends partly on events in other theatres. If the Rhine campaigns are going well, the Directory might accept limited results in Italy. If Rhine campaigns are also struggling, pressure to achieve something decisive somewhere becomes overwhelming. French domestic politics matter too. The Directory's internal stability depends partly on foreign policy success. Military victories justify their rule and distract from domestic problems. Military stalemates or defeats strengthen royalist and radical opposition. The political imperative for victory somewhere makes accepting stalemate everywhere increasingly difficult. By winter 1796 to 1797, the strategic situation in this timeline looks fundamentally different from history. France hasn't conquered Italy. Austria hasn't collapsed. The war continues without either side achieving decisive advantage. Both sides face the question of whether to continue fighting or to negotiate. Negotiation from this position produces different outcomes than the historical Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797. France negotiates from a weaker position, having failed to achieve decisive victory in Italy. Austria negotiates from a stronger position, having successfully defended their Italian interests at acceptable cost. The peace terms might give France control of northern Italian territories they've actually conquered, while Austria retains more of their Italian holdings than they did historically. France might gain recognition of their conquests in the Rhineland. Austria might receive compensation elsewhere for territories they cede. This is a compromise peace, not a decisive French victory. It reflects military stalemate rather than Austrian collapse. It leaves both sides somewhat dissatisfied but willing to accept terms rather than continue fighting. For Napoleon, this represents a problem. His reputation depends on decisive victory. Compromise peace after expensive, inconclusive campaign doesn't build the kind of legendary status he achieved historically. He's still a successful general, but not the miracle worker who conquered Italy against impossible odds. His political position within France weakens. He's delivered results, but not the spectacular success that would make him untouchable. Other generals look more competitive. The Directory feels less dependent on him. His leverage for future appointments and commands decreases. This matters for what happens next. Historically, Napoleon parlayed his Italian success into command of the Egyptian expedition in 1798. In this timeline, that command might go to someone else. Or the expedition might not happen at all if French strategic calculations differ, based on different results in Italy. Consider what Napoleon does in early 1797 if the Italian campaign ends in compromise peace rather than decisive victory. He's still a general, still politically connected, still ambitious. But his path to supreme power looks less clear. He might return to France to rebuild his political position, seeking new opportunities to demonstrate his abilities, maneuvering within Directory politics, watching for chances to command forces in future campaigns. He might remain in Italy as administrator of conquered territories, consolidating French control, building economic and political systems, demonstrating administrative competence rather than just military genius. He might push for new military operations, arguing that compromise peace is unstable and that renewed offensive could achieve the decisive victory that eluded him in 1796. Trying to maintain his position as France's premier general through continued military action. Each path leads somewhere different. None leads directly to the coup of 18 Brumaire that made him dictator in 1799. That coup succeeded partly because of his legendary military reputation and partly because of the Directory's desperate political situation. In this timeline, both factors are weaker. His reputation is good, but not legendary. The Directory is struggling, but not facing immediate collapse. Other generals have comparable credentials. The political dynamics that made Napoleon seem like the only solution to France's problems don't exist in the same form. This doesn't mean Napoleon disappears from history. It means his path to power becomes less direct and less certain. He remains an important figure in French politics and military affairs. But he's one important figure among several, rather than the uniquely dominant personality who overshadows everyone else. The broader European situation in 1797 differs too. A negotiated peace between France and Austria that doesn't represent decisive French victory changes how other powers view the balance of power. Britain sees that France can be contained through sustained resistance rather than collapsing before French military superiority. Prussia sees that Austria can defend its interests effectively. Russia sees that the European order isn't collapsing as quickly as feared. These perceptions affect subsequent diplomatic and military calculations. Britain might be more willing to continue fighting, seeing that France isn't invincible. Austria might be more confident about future conflicts. The coalition dynamics that characterize the next several years of warfare shift, because the baseline assumptions about French military superiority are different. France's internal politics evolve differently too. The Directory's stability depends partly on foreign policy success. Compromise peace rather than decisive victory provides less political benefit. Opposition groups gain ammunition for criticism. The sense that the revolution has produced military greatness becomes more ambiguous. This affects the Directory's ability to maintain power and legitimacy. They're not facing immediate collapse in 1797. But their political foundation is shakier than it would have been with decisive military success. That creates opportunities for opposition groups and alternative political movements. Napoleon remains part of this political landscape. His ambitions haven't changed. His abilities haven't diminished. But the circumstances that allowed him to seize power historically don't exist in the same form. He needs to navigate a different political environment, building support through different means, waiting for different opportunities. The key insight is that small changes in military performance can cascade into large changes in political outcomes. Improved Austrian defensive performance in Italy during 1796 doesn't just affect tactical battles. It affects operational campaigns. It affects strategic situations. It affects political calculations. It affects the trajectory of individual careers and the fate of governments. Napoleon doesn't become a failure in this timeline. He becomes a successful general who didn't achieve legendary status. That's a massive difference in terms of subsequent political possibilities. The French Revolution doesn't follow the same path. European warfare doesn't follow the same pattern. The balance of power evolves differently. And all of this flows from something as seemingly minor as Austrian generals learning from early defeats and implementing basic defensive improvements. Better reconnaissance, more careful deployment, stronger reserves, willingness to trade space for time. These aren't revolutionary innovations. They're competent military practice. But competent military practice against Napoleon in 1796 is enough to prevent the kind of decisive victories that made his historical reputation. And preventing those decisive victories changes everything that follows. The entire Napoleonic era as we know it depends on those victories happening. Remove them, and you remove the foundation for everything that came after. This timeline's version of Napoleon faces challenges his historical counterpart never encountered. In our timeline, his Italian campaign created such overwhelming success that political opportunities opened automatically. Doors flew open because everyone wanted to associate with victory. In this alternate 1797, he's achieved meaningful success, but not the kind that makes him indispensable. He's proven himself capable, but not irreplaceable. That's a fundamentally different political position. The French government in this scenario has options. They can rotate Napoleon to different commands without fear that they're wasting unique talent. They can assign other generals to crucial operations without worrying they're missing opportunities only Napoleon could exploit. The sense that this one man represents France's best hope for military success doesn't exist. Multiple generals have achieved comparable results against various enemies. Napoleon is one talented officer among several, not the singular genius who towers above all competitors. His personality hasn't changed, though. The ambition that drove him historically remains intact. The strategic vision that let him see opportunities others missed is still there. The political instincts that helped him navigate complex situations continue to serve him well. What's different is the environment he's operating in. The circumstances that allowed rapid advancement don't exist in the same form. He needs to be more patient, more calculating, more willing to build coalitions rather than dominating through sheer force of personality backed by undeniable achievement. Think about what this means for French politics in the late 1790s. The Directory faces serious problems. Economic difficulties persist. Political opposition from both left and right threatens stability. Foreign wars continue draining resources. But they don't face the same immediate crisis of legitimacy that characterized our timeline. They've achieved acceptable military results. The sense that only dramatic change can save France isn't as overwhelming. This gives the Directory more room to maneuver politically. Opposition groups can't point to military failure as proof that the current system is broken. The Royalists can't claim that only monarchy can effectively defend France. The radical left can't argue that revolutionary terror is necessary because the revolution is in danger. The Directory's moderate republicanism looks more viable when it's producing acceptable results rather than facing potential disaster. That doesn't make the Directory stable or popular, but it makes them harder to overthrow. Napoleon in this environment needs different tactics. He can't stage a coup in 1799 the way he did historically, because the political crisis that made that possible doesn't exist. The Directory isn't popular, but it's not on the verge of collapse. Military officers haven't lost confidence in civilian leadership to the same degree. The sense that France needs a strong man to save it from chaos is less compelling when chaos seems manageable rather than overwhelming. So what does Napoleon do? He builds political connections more carefully. He cultivates relationships with key Directory members. He positions himself as a reliable supporter of the existing system while quietly preparing for opportunities that might arise. He takes military commands that let him demonstrate competence without getting trapped in unwinnable situations. He stays visible, but not threatening. He waits. This requires patience that historical Napoleon didn't need. His meteoric rise happened so quickly that waiting wasn't necessary. By age 30, he controlled France. In this timeline, he's still building the foundation for potential future advancement. That's psychologically difficult for someone of his temperament. But it's the reality of this alternate political environment. The European situation continues evolving too. Austria's military performance improves after their experience in Italy. They've learned that properly conducted defensive operations can contain French armies. This doesn't make them invincible, but it makes them more confident. When the next round of warfare begins, Austrian strategy reflects these lessons. They're more willing to accept temporary setbacks while building toward counteroffensives. They're better at coordinating between different theatres. They're more careful about logistics and supply lines. This affects how the War of the Second Coalition unfolds. In our timeline, that war saw French defeats initially before Napoleon's return from Egypt led to victories that stabilized the situation. In this alternate timeline, the initial phase looks different. French armies face opponents who've learned from previous conflicts. Austrian generals apply lessons from Italy to other theatres. Results become more mixed on both sides. Britain's role changes too. Seeing that France can be contained through competent military opposition, British strategy becomes more aggressive. They're more willing to subsidize coalition partners, more willing to commit resources to continental warfare, more confident that sustained pressure can force France to accept unfavorable terms. This doesn't guarantee British success, but it changes their approach to the conflict. Russia's calculations shift as well. In our timeline, Russian intervention in the Second Coalition came partly from concern that Austria was collapsing before French power. In this alternate timeline, Austria looks more capable of defending itself. That might make Russia less eager to intervene, seeing less immediate threat. Or it might make them more eager, seeing better prospects for successful coalition warfare. The specific outcome depends on many factors, but the baseline assumptions are different. France's internal situation grows more complicated. The Directory faces economic problems that aren't solved by military success. Inflation continues. Food shortages occur periodically. Political divisions persist, but the government maintains enough legitimacy to keep functioning. They're not strong, but they're not collapsing. This creates a kind of chronic instability rather than acute crisis. Napoleon watches all this while advancing his career through more conventional means. He takes commands in different theatres. He achieves solid results without spectacular breakthroughs. He cultivates political allies carefully. He builds a reputation for competence and reliability. But he's still waiting for the opportunity that will let him seize real power. That opportunity might never come in the form it took historically. Consider how different this is from the historical trajectory. By 1799, Napoleon had conquered Italy, led the Egyptian expedition, returned to save France from crisis, and staged a successful coup. By age 30, he'd become first consul with effective dictatorial power. In this timeline at the same age, he's a respected general with political connections, but no clear path to supreme power. The gap between these trajectories is enormous. This affects not just Napoleon, but everyone around him. Officers who historically served under him during his rise to power have different careers. Politicians who allied with him when he seemed destined for greatness make different calculations. The entire network of relationships that formed around his historical success doesn't exist in the same form. He's still a significant figure, but not the central figure around whom French politics revolves. The broader revolutionary period extends differently too. In our timeline, Napoleon's seizure of power in 1799 effectively ended the revolutionary period and began the Napoleonic era. In this timeline, the Directory continues longer. The revolutionary era doesn't have a clear endpoint. Instead of dramatic transformation under military dictatorship, France experiences gradual evolution under unstable republican government. That's a fundamentally different historical experience. The question of what eventually happens to the Directory becomes crucial. They can't survive indefinitely. Their political foundation is too weak. Economic problems are too severe. But without the specific crisis that allowed Napoleon's historical coup, their collapse takes different forms. Maybe they're overthrown by a different military figure who sees opportunities Napoleon is still waiting for. Maybe civilian politicians manage to reform the system into something more stable. Maybe foreign military pressure forces changes in government. Each possibility leads to different outcomes. A different military dictator might have different abilities and ambitions than Napoleon. Reformed civilian government might survive longer but accomplish less. Foreign pressure might lead to negotiated settlements that preserve republican forms while limiting French power. The range of possibilities is wide because we've removed the specific path history actually followed. Napoleon himself faces interesting choices. Does he try to force opportunities that aren't naturally occurring? Does he risk attempting a coup without the overwhelming political crisis that made his historical coup possible? Or does he continue waiting, gambling that circumstances will eventually favour his ambitions? His decision depends on his assessment of risks and opportunities at specific moments. Attempting a coup without adequate preparation could end his career. The Directory might be unpopular, but they're not helpless. A failed coup attempt would destroy Napoleon's reputation and possibly his life. He'd need to be very confident about military and political support before making such an attempt. That confidence might never develop to the necessary level. Continuing to wait creates different risks. Other ambitious officers might seize opportunities he's letting pass. Political circumstances might evolve in directions that close off paths to power rather than opening them. Age becomes a factor too. Napoleon was young when he seized power historically. Waiting years longer might mean he's less energetic, less flexible, less able to inspire the kind of devotion that helped him dominate French politics. The European balance of power evolves without Napoleonic dominance reshaping the continent. France remains a major power, but not the overwhelming force that conquered most of Europe. Austria survives as a great power with more confidence. Prussia doesn't face the humiliation that historical defeats inflicted. Russia doesn't need to fight the massive campaigns that characterize the Napoleonic Wars. Britain doesn't face the existential threat of potential invasion. This creates a more stable European system in some ways. The apocalyptic warfare of the Napoleonic period doesn't occur. Millions of lives that were lost in those wars continue. The economic devastation that warfare inflicted is avoided. But instability continues at lower levels. Frequent smaller conflicts rather than massive continental wars. Shifting alliances and territorial adjustments. The kind of traditional European politics that existed before the Revolutionary Wars, but now operating in a context shaped by revolutionary ideology and changed political expectations. France's revolutionary legacy persists without Napoleon to export it through conquest. Revolutionary ideas spread through different mechanisms. Debate rather than military occupation. Gradual influence rather than imposed systems. Some states adopt aspects of revolutionary governance voluntarily. Others resist more successfully because they're not facing overwhelming French military pressure. The result is a more varied European political landscape. Nationalism develops differently too. In our timeline, Napoleonic conquest sparked nationalist resistance movements throughout Europe. German nationalism, Italian nationalism, Spanish nationalism all grew partly in reaction to French domination. Without that domination, nationalist movements have different origins and characters. They might develop more slowly, or they might develop through different mechanisms entirely. The trajectory of 19th century European nationalism shifts in ways that cascade through subsequent history. The Industrial Revolution proceeds on schedule since these political changes don't affect the underlying technological and economic factors driving industrialization. But the political context in which industrialization occurs is different. French political instability might slow industrial development there. German states without the trauma of Napoleonic defeat might industrialize differently. British industry develops without the same wartime pressures and opportunities. This alternate late 1790s and early 1800s represents a world where contingency matters enormously. Small changes in Austrian military performance in 1796 have cascaded into large changes in European politics. Napoleon hasn't disappeared, but his role has transformed. The French Revolution continues without transitioning into Napoleonic dictatorship. European warfare continues without the massive conflicts that characterized the Napoleonic era. The balance of power remains fluid without one state achieving temporary hegemony. What happens next depends on thousands of individual decisions by people responding to circumstances that differ from our timeline. Napoleon might eventually seize power through different means, or someone else might fill the role he played historically, or France might develop constitutional republicanism that proves more stable, or foreign powers might intervene more successfully to contain French expansion. The range of possibilities remains wide because we're early in the divergence from our timeline. The key insight is that military performance matters not just tactically, but strategically and politically. Battles aren't isolated events. They're part of campaigns that shape political reputations and create opportunities for advancement. Campaign outcomes affect governmental stability and international relationships. These effects compound over time. What starts as improved Austrian defensive tactics in Italy during 1796 becomes transformed European politics by 1800. Napoleon in this timeline is still Napoleon. His abilities haven't changed. His ambitions haven't diminished. What's changed is the environment he's operating in and the opportunities available to him. That's enough to redirect his entire career and through it, reshape the era that might have borne his name. The European political landscape in this alternate timeline continues to evolve through mechanisms we recognize, but in combinations that differ fundamentally from our history. France remains revolutionary but not Napoleonic. The distinction matters more than it might initially appear. In our timeline, Napoleon transformed French revolutionary ideology into something new. The combination of revolutionary principles with authoritarian efficiency created a hybrid system that proved remarkably exportable through conquest. Revolutionary nationalism merged with military power to create French domination that reshaped the entire continent. Without that transformation, revolutionary France develops differently. The Directory continues its unstable existence. Corruption remains endemic. Political factions maneuver constantly. Military leaders gain influence, but not supreme power. This creates a peculiar situation where France remains internally chaotic yet externally influential. Revolutionary ideas spread not through imposed constitutions, but through example and debate. Some European intellectuals embrace French revolutionary principles, others react against them. But the reaction is ideological rather than nationalist. People resist ideas rather than military occupation. This distinction shapes how revolutionary ideology evolves throughout Europe. German states debate constitutional reform without the unifying experience of fighting French conquest. Italian intellectuals discuss national unity without Bonaparte's Kingdom of Italy as a model. Spanish liberals advocate for change without the trauma of Peninsular War. Each region develops its own relationship with revolutionary ideas based on internal dynamics rather than external imposition. Austria under Archduke Charles pursues military modernization that extends beyond tactical reforms. The success in Italy during 1796 demonstrated that traditional armies could adapt to revolutionary warfare. This lesson resonates throughout the Habsburg military establishment. Training improves, command structures evolve, staff work becomes more sophisticated. The Austrian army of 1805 in this timeline is considerably more effective than its counterpart in our history. This matters because European military balance remains fluid. France still fields effective armies. Revolutionary enthusiasm and improved tactics make French forces formidable opponents. But they're not invincible. Other powers can compete effectively through their own reforms. This creates a more balanced military environment than existed in our timeline when Napoleon's genius gave France overwhelming advantages. Prussia in this timeline faces different pressures. Without the catastrophic defeat at Jena in 1806, Prussian military reform takes a different path. The army remains confident in traditional methods longer. Frederick William III doesn't face the existential crisis that drove radical military reform in our history. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau still advocate for change, but without the urgency that defeat provides. Prussian military development proceeds more gradually. Russia benefits from avoiding the disasters that Napoleon inflicted. No Austerlitz in 1805, no Friedland in 1807, no catastrophic invasion in 1812. Russian military prestige remains higher. The army doesn't need the desperate reforms that followed repeated defeats by French forces. This creates interesting strategic implications for later conflicts. Russia enters the middle decades of the 19th century with different military traditions and different geopolitical ambitions. Britain's role shifts subtly but significantly. Without the Napoleonic threat, British naval supremacy faces different challenges. The continental system never develops, so British trade isn't subjected to the same pressures. Military spending patterns differ without the need to fund massive coalitions against French hegemony. British gold still influences European politics, but through different mechanisms and toward different objectives. The economic consequences of this alternate timeline compound over decades. Warfare continues throughout the period, but smaller-scale conflicts cause less destruction than the massive Napoleonic campaigns. Agricultural production doesn't face the same disruptions. Trade routes remain more stable. Capital accumulation proceeds with fewer interruptions. These differences seem minor initially, but compound over time. Consider textile manufacturing. In our timeline, British industry benefited enormously from continental warfare that disrupted competitors. French industry suffered from blockades and military demands. German and Italian manufacturing faced occupation and warfare. In this alternate timeline, continental industry develops under less pressure, but also with fewer artificial advantages for British manufacturers. Industrial development becomes more geographically distributed. The spread of industrial technology follows different patterns too. In our timeline, Napoleon's continental system inadvertently encouraged industrialization in some regions by forcing import substitution. Without that pressure, continental industrialization might proceed more slowly in some sectors. But political instability doesn't disrupt it as severely. The net effect remains uncertain but definitely different. Financial systems evolve under different constraints. The massive war loans that characterize the Napoleonic era don't occur on the same scale. British national debt grows more slowly. French finances remain chaotic but without the brief stabilization that Napoleon achieved. German states don't face the same financial pressures from occupation and reparations. These variations in public finance affect private capital markets and investment patterns throughout Europe. Napoleon himself represents a fascinating counterfactual subject. His abilities haven't changed, his strategic genius remains intact, his political instincts are still sharp, but opportunities have shifted. Without the Italian campaign's spectacular success, his path to power closes. He remains a talented general, rather than becoming an indispensable national figure. This demonstrates how much historical outcomes depend on opportunity, rather than ability alone. Does Napoleon eventually seize power through different means? Perhaps. His ambition certainly persists. His talent for recognizing and exploiting opportunities remains keen. But the specific circumstances that enabled his rise in our timeline don't recur. He might lead a different coup. He might achieve power through more gradual political advancement. Or he might remain a frustrated talent, recognized by contemporaries but never given the opportunity to reshape Europe. The uncertainty illustrates an important principle about alternate history. We can trace immediate consequences of changed events with reasonable confidence. Austrian success in Italy leads to political survival for Archduke Charles. French failure undermines the Directory's stability differently. These direct connections are relatively clear. But second and third order effects become increasingly speculative. Does Napoleon eventually rise through different means? We can't determine that with confidence because too many variables intervene. What we can say is that European politics in 1805 looks fundamentally different than in our timeline. No French Empire under Napoleon, no Confederation of the Rhine reorganizing Germany, no continental system strangling British trade, no Peninsular War devastating Spain. These massive historical events simply don't occur. The space they occupied in our timeline is filled by other developments we can only sketch in broad outline. Diplomatic relationships follow different patterns. The coalition warfare that characterized our timeline's Napoleonic period doesn't develop the same way. Alliances shift more frequently because no single threat dominates European politics. Austria and Russia don't cooperate against overwhelming French power. Britain doesn't coordinate massive coalitions. Prussia doesn't swing between French alliance and desperate resistance. The familiar diplomatic patterns of 1800 to 1815 are replaced by more traditional balance of power politics. This affects how European statesmen think about international relations. In our timeline, the Napoleonic threat created temporary consensus about containing France. The concert of Europe that emerged after 1815 reflected shared determination to prevent another Napoleon. Without that shared experience, post-revolutionary European diplomacy develops differently. There's no equivalent to the Congress of Vienna, because there's no equivalent to Napoleonic domination requiring comprehensive settlement. Cultural developments shift in subtle ways. The Romantic movement still emerges, but without the same relationship to Napoleonic warfare. Lord Byron doesn't have Napoleon as a heroic figure to romanticize. Beethoven's relationship to revolutionary ideals develops differently without Bonaparte as a symbol of both revolutionary promise and dictatorial reality. Goethe's later works reflect different political circumstances. These seem like minor changes, but culture shapes how people understand their world and their possibilities. Educational reforms that Napoleon implemented in France don't occur. The lycée system develops differently or not at all. The grande écoles follow alternative paths. French intellectual life continues revolutionary ferment without Napoleonic direction. This affects the next generation of French thinkers and leaders who emerge from different educational experiences. Legal development follows a completely different trajectory. The Napoleonic Code never gets created. French law continues its revolutionary evolution without the comprehensive codification that Bonaparte imposed. German states aren't presented with French legal models to adopt or resist. Italian law develops through different influences. The legal traditions of 19th century Europe diverge significantly from our timeline. Military technology proceeds on schedule since the underlying scientific and industrial developments that drove innovation haven't changed. Artillery improves, infantry weapons evolve, naval technology advances, but the tactical and strategic doctrines that emerge from actual warfare differ. Commanders learn different lessons from different battles. Military theory develops through different experiences. The armies of 1830 or 1840 in this timeline employ technologies similar to our timeline, but doctrine and organization that reflect their alternate history. The question of nationalism becomes increasingly central as we move into the 19th century. In our timeline, Napoleonic conquest sparked nationalist reactions throughout Europe. German nationalism emerged partly from resistance to French domination. Italian nationalism took inspiration from Napoleon's brief unification. Polish nationalism was shaped by the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Without these experiences, nationalist movements have different origins and characters. German nationalism without Napoleon to resist develops more slowly and with different character. It might remain primarily cultural rather than becoming intensely political. The War of Liberation doesn't occur to create shared German identity through military struggle against France. Prussian reform doesn't have the same urgency or direction. The eventual unification of Germany, if it occurs at all, follows a completely different path. Italian nationalism faces similar differences. Without Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy demonstrating that Italian unification was possible, nationalist thinkers lack that concrete example. The Risorgimento develops from different origins toward potentially different conclusions. Regional identities might remain stronger, or unification might occur through different mechanisms led by different states. Poland's fate shifts dramatically. Without the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, Polish nationalism doesn't have the brief revival that shaped subsequent movements. The partition of Poland stands without even temporary reversal. Polish exiles and nationalists organize around different experiences and different goals. The November Uprising of 1830 either doesn't occur or happens for completely different reasons in different circumstances. Spain's political development diverges sharply from our timeline. No Peninsular War means no catastrophic destruction of Spanish power. The Bourbon monarchy continues without the trauma of French occupation and British intervention. Spanish liberalism develops through internal pressures rather than arising from resistance to French rule. The loss of American colonies might proceed differently without the disruption that the Peninsular War caused to Spanish imperial authority. Colonial developments throughout the Americas reflect these European changes. Spanish-American independence movements face different circumstances without the Peninsular War weakening metropolitan authority. British naval supremacy isn't demonstrated through the same victories. French colonial ambitions don't revive under Napoleon. Brazilian independence from Portugal follows a different path. The entire process of American decolonization occurs in a different political context. The United States develops through its early national period without the specific international pressures that shaped our timeline. The Louisiana Purchase might not occur because Napoleon never sells territory to fund European wars. American territorial expansion follows different patterns. The War of 1812 might not happen or might occur for different reasons with different results. Early American foreign policy responds to a different European balance of power. Global trade patterns shift as European warfare and politics follow alternative trajectories. The British Empire continues expanding but without the specific opportunities that Napoleonic warfare created. India's incorporation into the empire proceeds differently without the specific circumstances that our timeline provided. Competition with France for colonial influence occurs, but through different mechanisms. Dutch colonies face different pressures. The entire structure of European imperialism develops through alternate paths. Technology transfer between Europe and the rest of the world follows different routes. Industrial knowledge spreads through different mechanisms when European politics don't follow our timeline's patterns. Japanese modernization eventually occurs, but responding to different Western pressures. Chinese encounters with European power happen through different circumstances. The entire process of global technological diffusion shifts in ways that compound over decades. By the 1820s, this alternate timeline has diverged so substantially that specific predictions become impossible. We can identify broad tendencies and structural differences, but not specific events. What we know is that the world looks fundamentally different than our timeline. No Napoleonic legend shapes Romantic nationalism. No Congress of Vienna creates the post-revolutionary settlement. No concert of Europe manages great power relations. No Napoleonic code provides a legal model. The entire 19th century develops from different foundations toward uncertain destinations. Cultural developments across continents reflect these fundamental political changes as artistic movements respond to different stimuli and different patrons. European Romanticism emerges but without the Napoleonic legend as a central reference point. Writers and artists don't have the Grand Army's retreat from Moscow or the 100 Days as defining moments to process through creative work. Byron doesn't become the archetype of the romantic hero fighting for Greek independence because the European political context that shaped those events develops differently. German philosophy takes alternate paths when Hegel doesn't witness Napoleon entering Jena and doesn't develop his philosophy of history around that experience. Fichte's nationalism responds to different German political circumstances. The entire trajectory of German idealism shifts when its foundational thinkers encounter different historical circumstances. Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard eventually emerge, but their thought develops in response to different cultural conditions. French intellectual life proceeds without the trauma and glory of the Napoleonic period shaping every subsequent debate. The split between liberals and reactionaries happens along different fault lines. Victor Hugo doesn't write about the Battle of Waterloo in Les Miserables because Waterloo never occurs. French historical memory contains different reference points and different wounds. The entire structure of French political culture develops through alternate conflicts and alternate resolutions. British culture loses the specific forms that opposition to Napoleon created. There's no Trafalgar to celebrate, no Wellington to mythologize. British national identity constructs itself around different achievements and different threats. Jane Austen still writes novels of manners, but the anxieties about French invasion that subtly permeate her work take different forms. Scott's historical novels respond to different political contexts. The entire flowering of British Romanticism happens, but with different themes and different concerns. Music develops through different patronage networks and different political contexts. Beethoven doesn't compose the Eroica Symphony, or doesn't dedicate and then undedicate it to Napoleon. His Third Symphony either celebrates different heroes or doesn't exist at all. The entire arc of his career shifts when European political history follows a different course. Later composers respond to different cultural memories and different political circumstances. Visual arts reflect these changed contexts, as painters lack certain subjects while gaining others. David doesn't paint Napoleon crossing the Alps or crowning himself emperor. Goya doesn't witness the specific atrocities of the Peninsular War that produced his most powerful work. Instead, these artists either focus on different subjects or never achieve the same prominence. The entire development of neoclassicism into Romanticism follows alternate aesthetic and political trajectories. Architecture across Europe develops without the specific influences that Napoleonic conquest spread. The empire style doesn't emerge or emerges in different forms. Cities aren't rebuilt according to the same principles. Urban planning follows different models. The physical landscape of European cities develops through different influences and different priorities. Paris doesn't acquire the specific character that Napoleon's renovations and his nephew's later transformation created. Educational systems throughout Europe develop along different lines without the Napoleonic model to emulate or resist. The French university system doesn't reorganize around the Grande École. German universities don't reform themselves in conscious opposition to French methods. The entire structure of European higher education follows alternate patterns of development and different relationships between state authority and academic autonomy. Legal systems show perhaps the most concrete differences, as the Napoleonic Code doesn't spread through conquest and doesn't serve as a model for later reforms. Civil law traditions develop through different mechanisms. Property rights evolve differently. Family law follows alternate paths. The entire structure of continental legal systems reflects different foundations and different principles. Common law and civil law traditions interact through different mechanisms. Military organization and tactics develop without the specific innovations that Napoleonic warfare introduced. The core system might eventually emerge, but through different circumstances. Staff organization follows different models. The relationship between military and civil authority in European states develops through different conflicts and different resolutions. Military professionalism advances, but along alternate paths toward potentially different destinations. Economic thought responds to different circumstances as theorists analyze different patterns of trade, different forms of warfare, and different relationships between states and markets. Ricardo still develops theories of comparative advantage, but applies them to different trading patterns. Malthus still worries about population growth, but in response to different demographic and political circumstances. The entire classical school of political economy emerges, but with different emphases and different policy recommendations. Scientific development continues, but with different institutional support and different practical applications. State funding for research follows different patterns. Military needs drive different innovations. International scientific communication networks operate through different political constraints. The advance of knowledge continues, but through different mechanisms and toward different initial applications. Medicine progresses without the specific advances that Napoleonic military needs stimulated. Surgical techniques develop differently without the specific pressures of treating massive battlefield casualties. Public health initiatives respond to different epidemics and different political priorities. The entire structure of medical education and practice develops through alternate paths of professionalization and state involvement. Transportation networks across Europe develop according to different strategic and economic priorities. Roads aren't built to the same specifications or connecting the same cities. Canal systems respond to different commercial needs. The early development of railways happens in a different political and economic context. The entire infrastructure of European commerce and communication reflects different planning and different investments. Agricultural improvements spread through different mechanisms when political boundaries and military needs follow alternate patterns. Crop rotation techniques diffuse differently. Livestock breeding programs respond to different market demands. The enclosure movement in Britain proceeds without the specific food security concerns that the Napoleonic Wars created. Rural social structures evolve through different pressures and different opportunities. Banking and finance develop without the specific strains that financing the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars placed on European economies. The Bank of England doesn't suspend gold convertibility, or doesn't do so under the same circumstances. Continental financial systems develop different relationships with their governments. The entire structure of public debt and central banking evolves through different crises and different innovations. Insurance markets respond to different risks when European warfare follows different patterns. Maritime insurance rates reflect different naval threats. Life insurance develops in response to different mortality patterns. The entire structure of risk management and actuarial science emerges but calibrated to different historical experiences and different expectations about future conflicts. Labour movements organise around different grievances when industrialisation proceeds without the specific dislocations that our timeline's warfare created. Trade unions form, but in response to different economic conditions. Socialist thought develops, but analysing different patterns of inequality and different relationships between workers and capital. The entire trajectory of working-class political organisation follows alternate paths. Women's roles in society evolve through different mechanisms. When warfare and political upheaval don't create the same opportunities or the same disruptions, women don't serve in the same auxiliary roles that Napoleonic armies created. Female education develops through different pressures. The entire process of changing gender relations proceeds along different timelines and through different social movements. Religious developments across Europe respond to different political contexts when church-state relations don't experience the specific conflicts that the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods created. Catholic institutions don't face the same confiscations or the same later concordats. Protestant churches don't organise around the same political divisions. Jewish emancipation proceeds differently without the specific circumstances that Napoleon's conquest created in various territories. Colonial administration develops different models when European powers don't have the Napoleonic example of satellite kingdoms and imposed constitutions. The British Empire governs its territories according to different principles. French colonialism eventually revives, but drawing on different experiences and different theories. Spanish and Portuguese colonial relationships with their American territories follow different evolutionary paths. Immigration patterns shift as European political and economic conditions develop differently. People flee different conflicts and seek opportunities in different places. The settlement of the Americas proceeds with different demographic compositions and different cultural influences. The entire process of global migration responds to an alternate set of political and economic pressures. Urban development throughout the Atlantic world reflects these changed migration patterns and different economic structures. Cities grow in different locations and at different rates. Industrial centres emerge, but distributed differently across regions. The entire pattern of urbanisation follows alternate geographic and economic logic. Public health challenges emerge differently when urbanisation and industrialisation proceed along alternate timelines. Cholera epidemics might strike at different times or in different places. Responses to public health crises reflect different governmental capacities and different scientific knowledge. The entire development of public health infrastructure happens through different mechanisms and different political pressures. Literacy rates develop differently when educational systems follow alternate patterns and different political priorities drive school construction. Popular literacy spreads through different mechanisms. The relationship between literacy and political participation evolves along different timelines. The entire democratization of knowledge proceeds through alternate channels and toward potentially different destinations. Popular culture develops without the specific forms that Napoleonic legend created. Folk songs celebrate different heroes and different victories. Popular prints depict different scenes. The entire structure of mass culture emerges, but drawing on different historical memories and different political symbols. Nationalism finds different cultural expressions when it can't reference Napoleon's example. Sports and leisure activities evolve through different social contexts, when industrialization and urbanization follow alternate patterns. The codification of modern sports happens, but perhaps at different times or in different forms. Popular entertainments respond to different audiences with different experiences and different expectations. The entire structure of commercial leisure develops through different economic and social circumstances. Family structures adapt to different economic and political conditions when social changes proceed along alternate timelines. Marriage patterns shift in response to different property laws and different economic opportunities. Inheritance practices evolve through different legal frameworks. The entire organization of domestic life responds to different pressures and different possibilities. Childhood experiences differ substantially when educational opportunities, labor demands, and family economies develop through alternate patterns. Child labor laws emerge in response to different political movements. Educational expectations shift according to different economic needs. The entire concept of childhood evolves through different social and economic transformations. Old age and retirement develop as social categories through different mechanisms when life expectancy, economic security, and family structures follow alternate evolutionary paths. Pension systems emerge or don't emerge according to different political and economic pressures. The entire life cycle experience reflects different social organizations and different economic realities. By mid-century in this alternate timeline, the cumulative weight of these differences has created a world that would be barely recognizable to someone transported from our timeline's 1850. The political map shows different boundaries. The economic system operates through different mechanisms. Social structures reflect different historical developments. Cultural production responds to different memories and different aspirations. Trying to trace this alternate timeline forward becomes increasingly speculative. Would industrialization eventually produce similar social changes despite different political contexts? Would nationalism still emerge as the dominant political force of the century? Would democracy spread through different mechanisms? Would science and technology develop along similar trajectories despite different institutional support? Some historians argue that structural forces would eventually produce convergence. Industrial capitalism creates similar pressures regardless of specific political circumstances. Technological development follows certain logical progressions. Demographic transitions happen when certain economic conditions emerge. By this argument, the late 19th century and our alternate timeline might look surprisingly similar to our own, despite the different path taken to reach it. Other analysts emphasize path dependence and contingency. Each difference compounds over time, creating increasingly divergent possibilities. Political institutions shape economic development. Cultural factors influence technological adoption. Social structures determine how populations respond to similar challenges. By this argument, our alternate timeline diverges increasingly over time until the world of 1900 bears little resemblance to the world we know. The truth likely lies somewhere between these positions. Some aspects of historical development probably reflect deep structural forces that would operate similarly across different timelines. Other aspects depend heavily on specific circumstances and contingent choices that could easily have gone differently. What we can say with confidence is that the world without Napoleon looks fundamentally different at every level of analysis. Political boundaries don't match our maps. Legal systems operate on different principles. Cultural memories reference different events. Economic structures develop through different crises. Social movements organized around different grievances. Intellectual traditions responded to different challenges. The exercise of imagining this alternate timeline reminds us how much our world results from contingent choices and unpredictable events rather than inevitable forces. Napoleon wasn't destined to rise from obscure Corsican origins to reshape Europe. His victories resulted from specific tactical decisions that could have gone differently. His political success depended on circumstances that easily might not have occurred. The entire Napoleonic period represents one possible outcome from the French Revolution rather than the only possible outcome. Understanding this contingency helps us think more clearly about our own historical moment. The future isn't predetermined. Different choices lead to different outcomes. Small changes compound into massive transformations. Individual actions matter even as structural forces constrain possibilities. History happens through the interaction of human choices and historical circumstances, creating outcomes that weren't inevitable but make sense in retrospect. That's what makes studying alternate timelines valuable despite their necessarily speculative character. They force us to question assumptions about historical inevitability. They highlight the contingency underlying events we take for granted. They remind us that the world we inherited resulted from specific choices and specific accidents rather than predetermined destiny. And they suggest that our own choices today help shape possibilities that future generations will inherit, for better or worse, in ways we can influence but never completely control. The question we started with seems almost quaint now. Could Maldini's defensive principles have stopped Napoleon in Italy? The answer is yes, probably, at least enough to matter. But that was never really the point. What matters is recognizing how fragile historical inevitability actually is. Napoleon didn't conquer Europe because destiny demanded it. He conquered Europe because a series of specific tactical decisions went his way in 1796. Austrian generals made predictable mistakes. Defensive positions were poorly chosen. Coordination failed at crucial moments. Those failures compounded into catastrophe, and catastrophe created the legend. Change those early battles, and you change everything, not just military outcomes, political trajectories, cultural memories, the entire architecture of the 19th century. Because history doesn't flow from abstract forces. It emerges from specific choices made by specific people in specific circumstances. And those choices create paths that future choices must navigate. Maldini defending Milan represents competence rather than genius. Basic principles executed consistently, proper positioning, systematic preparation, defensive depth, nothing revolutionary, just professionalism applied to warfare instead of football. But professionalism in 1796 would have been revolutionary precisely because it was so absent. Austrian forces didn't need superhuman defenders. They needed commanders who understood fundamentals and applied them under pressure. That's what Maldini embodied throughout his career. Not superhuman ability, exceptional consistency in executing principles that anyone could understand, but few could maintain through 25 years of elite competition. The same principles that made him untouchable at San Siro would have made Austrian positions in Lombardy far more expensive to crack. Not impregnable. Just expensive enough to change calculations. Expensive enough to disrupt timelines. Expensive enough to prevent the kind of decisive victory that creates legends and reshapes continents. And that's the real lesson. The grand sweeps of history that seem inevitable in retrospect often depend on narrow margins in the moment. A few thousand casualties here. A couple weeks delay there. Political pressure that builds slightly faster or slightly slower. These small differences compound into massive transformations because historical development isn't linear, it's exponential. Each choice constrains or enables future choices until you're operating in completely different possibility spaces. Napoleon might still have risen eventually. Talented people usually find opportunities. But without the Italian campaign's spectacular success, his path looks completely different. Maybe he leads a different coup at a different moment. Maybe someone else seizes the opportunity he's waiting for. Maybe France develops constitutional republicanism that proves more stable than anyone expected? We can't know. That's the point. Remove the specific circumstances that enabled his historical rise, and you remove the certainty of any particular outcome. You're left with structural forces and individual choices interacting in ways that create possibilities rather than destinies. The world without Napoleon is different at every level because Napoleon reshaped everything he touched. Not just political boundaries, but legal systems. Not just military doctrine, but cultural memory. Not just French politics, but global power structures. His absence leaves a void that gets filled by something. But what that something looks like depends on thousands of subsequent choices we can't predict. That's what alternate history teaches us when done honestly. Not that we can predict what would have happened differently, but that what did happen wasn't inevitable. The world we inherited resulted from contingent choices as much as structural forces. And understanding that contingency helps us think more clearly about the choices we face now, because we're living in someone else's alternate timeline. Every decision we make creates or forecloses possibilities for futures we'll never see. The consequences compound exponentially, just like they did in 1796. Small choices matter. Competent execution of basic principles matters. Consistency matters. Preparation matters. Maldini understood that. He didn't try to be superhuman. He tried to be consistently excellent at fundamental tasks. Position correctly. Anticipate threats. Maintain composure under pressure. Execute the basics perfectly for 25 years. That's what made him exceptional. Applied to 1796 Italy, those same principles would have changed European history. Not through genius, but through competence. Not through revolution, but through professionalism. Not through superhuman intervention, but through systematic application of sound defensive principles against an opponent who, for all his brilliance, wasn't invincible. Just very good at exploiting the specific mistakes his historical opponents made. Remove those mistakes, and you remove the inevitability. What replaces it remains uncertain. But that uncertainty is the point. History happens through choices, not destiny. And sometimes the most important choice is simply executing fundamentals well when everyone around you is failing to do so. That's what Maldini would have brought to Milan in 1796, not miracles. Just competence at exactly the moment when competence would have mattered most.